Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I appreciate that you've joined us for this presentation. CLASS-LLC and VerSprite have teamed up to bring you a great discussion about geo-cyber supply chain risks and opportunities. To support this presentation, we have a great lineup of speakers, so I hope that you enjoy the presentation. We look forward to your feedback and we look forward to your engagement throughout the conversation. To get us started, I will hand it over to each of our panelists to do a self-introduction. And once all the introductions are complete, we will hand it over to Milena to give us a brief overview of the topic before we get into the discussion questions. We'll start with Malcolm, then we'll go from Malcolm to Andrew to Milena, and then she'll have the opportunity to both introduce herself and move forward in the that supports the discussion.
Hey, thanks for having me on and happy to participate on this. This is Malcolm Harkins. Previously, I was Chief Security and Privacy Officer for Intel Corporation worldwide, overseeing physical, logical, information risk security type items. And for the past 4 years, after I left Intel, I've been Chief Security, basically doing the same thing, but in this case for a software cybersecurity startup.
Awesome, thank you. And Andrew?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this conversation today. My name is Andrew Neal. I'm currently the President of Information Security and Compliance Services for TransPerfect, a business services company. Prior to that, I ran our global digital forensics operation. My kind of day-to-day driver at TransPerfect is helping our internal and external clients address issues related to so anything having to do with all the wonderful data regulations we have out there, information security breach laws, those kinds of things. So happy to join you all, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Milena. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm Milena Rodban, Senior Security Consultant at VerSprite. We are a cybersecurity firm with a geopolitical risk practice, focusing on issues that exist at the intersection of cybersecurity and geopolitics. And I have about 10 years of experience in the geopolitical risk field, primarily designing interactive simulations that help clients explore how these issues both exacerbate. They do everything from strategic planning to daily workflows. And I will be giving a brief overview of the major issues in play here. Let's start with the physical supply chain. Obviously, we're all familiar with how we take a concept, prototype, finance, source of materials for it, manufacture an item, assemble it, package it, do quality control, store it somewhere, distribute it to sales partners, and then sell it to a buyer. This has been going on ever since, Tom started making widgets in a factory, all the way to now when Adidas makes sneakers and sells them to consumers. But now what we have is a parallel digital information supply chain that tracks every element in this process and adds those opportunities and vulnerabilities to the situation, allowing people to have greater visibility and trackability of their supply chain, but also opening it up to major challenges like breaches, insider threats, passive sensitive information, IP theft, etc. And we have, a situation where previously maybe criminals could have stalked where a known trucking route existed and were able to rob one truck, and you could write off that loss as part of your standard operating cost. And now we have the ability for a cyber criminal to get massive information about your organization, diverting payments, stealing financial information, stealing very sensitive data, and really compromise is much faster and much cheaper for the cyber criminal and much more expensive for the companies that have to deal with the aftermath. In terms of the digital supply chain, we have a similar sort of flow where you create a concept, you produce it, you manage it, you upload it to a platform, and again, you have that parallel process where every step of the way is tracked, and in fact, you have the Internet of Things now where the actual devices that people use to consume some of the information that you're selling to them can be hacked. And you really depend on those devices being safe and secure for people to be able to access your content. So you have an added layer where you have to consider the fact that you're not just selling your content directly to a consumer, you're not just selling a widget, you're selling a song or a movie that you depend on platforms being available for you to sell it on. And now not only can your content be compromised by cyber criminals, but so can the platforms and the devices themselves. So industries like the video gaming industry, for example, have kind of come to grips with the challenges here, and they know that they have to make the majority of their money on launch day, because after launch day, people are able to steal a game, to manipulate it, and in effect cut off the flow of profitability for the video game firm. And so you see a lot more investment in that launch day being successful and making sure that marketing surrounds that launch day and making sure that all the profit is made then to really recoup the cost of development. And so companies have found lots of different workarounds for some of these issues, but increasingly we're seeing people need to understand not only the supply chain challenges and opportunities, but also on the digital end, on the cyber end, what needs to go into these things successful and to really mitigate a lot of the dangers out there that are seemingly on a daily basis adding to the complexity of supply chain management around the world. Let's take a look at a couple of recent case studies. Some of you may be familiar with the Qatar political crisis. Of course, Saudi Arabia and its allies have, in effect, embargoed Qatar, which is a very small nation and has historically relied on all of its food supplies being imported over overland routes. So those routes tend to go through Saudi Arabia, and when they cut off that route, Qatar had to invest tremendously in shipping in food, in shipping in even cows to provide for a dairy supply for the people living in the country. And these involve tremendous costs, which another country or another entity might not have been able to field. So it presented a lot of opportunities for companies that are able to create sort of non-traditional ways of supplying a country and supplying the market. But it really highlighted the dangers of doing things like creating e-commerce platforms in the Middle East. You know, to do a U.S.-based parallel, it would be as if Colorado decided to cut off all of its, if the states surrounding Colorado decided to cut off all the routes into Colorado, and you weren't able from north or south or east or west to get into the state to supply it. And that kind of danger doesn't exist in the U.S., and so we've been able to have things like Amazon and Walmart and a lot of other retailers take advantage of the opportunity of open state borders and very little danger of any type of embargo. But in the Middle East and in other areas where countries really do rely on very limited transit routes to be able to supply a market, these dangers are ever present and need to be understood within a geopolitical framework, not just within a framework of what is and isn't possible from a supply chain mentality. Similarly with China's Belt and Road, we've seen a lot of uneven progress, we've seen a lot of debt trap diplomacy, and so companies that are very dependent on better infrastructure existing along that Belt and Road route so that they can supply markets in Asia and in Africa, they're having to contend with the fact that with uneven progress, they have to think of new ways to reach those markets. And that can be contrasted with the way that Japan has gone through an infrastructure development program where the focus is on making very strategic, really seeing projects to the end to make sure that they're done in a way that can really benefit private firms and their ability to both involve themselves in infrastructure construction and then being able to take advantage of the infrastructure that is built to reach those new markets and to open up opportunities for Japanese companies. We've seen Adidas have a lot of difficulties with, being very successful. Originally, when Kanye West partnered with Adidas, they were hoping to release very limited supplies of Kanye's very popular shoes, and they were able to create a supply chain that supported that production pretty easily. But in later iterations, when the team behind the shoe decided to boost production and make greater numbers available to take advantage of growing demand, the company has really struggled to find ways to boost its supply chain capacity and to really create the shoes at the quality level that is demanded by the company. And so even an opportunity, when not well thought through, when not understood from both a geopolitical and a technical background, can yield a massive talent and lost revenue. Similarly, Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico had been a huge hub for medical supplies that were able to be produced more cheaply there, and was destroyed, unfortunately, by Hurricane Maria, and dealt a big blow to medical supplies all over the United States. Both saline bags and gloves became in short supply. And so really understanding where you're basing a very strategic and very vital production facility needs to be understood from the standpoint of the political risk issue of, can the government then deal with a natural disaster? Can it rebuild quickly enough to restart that supply chain of critical items? We can contrast that with Home Depot taking a very strategic approach to this and understanding the dangers and staging very sensitive supplies in areas that are likely to be safe from destruction and are likely to be able to resist a major storm and be able to provide supplies for people in the aftermath. Hopefully the next slide is up now. I think there's a bit of a lag on my platform. In terms of digital supply chain issues, we're seeing a lot of new regulations that require local content quotas. So, for example, the EU requires that Netflix have at any moment 30% of the offerings available to European customers be local content. This, of course, presents a tremendous opportunity for local content producers to be able to take advantage of those quotas and reach new markets. But it also does create greater challenges for companies that have to meet those quotas in terms of being able to source the content, making sure it's of a quality that they need to be able to put on their platform and maintain their reputational and competitive edge over other companies. The U.S.-China trade war has been a major hit to the digital supply chain in terms of 5G rollouts. Of course, a lot of companies are depending on 5G infrastructure to help underpin a lot of the technological progress that they're trying to make. And in the absence of that infrastructure or delays of that infrastructure, that hits a lot of private firms that are depending on it to be able to do their work and provide services and platforms to customers, again, because they rely on that additional infrastructure barrier and they cannot sell directly to clients. And this, of course, presents a tremendous opportunity for other suppliers. So if the U.S. is banning Huawei because of the U.S.-China trade war, other companies that traditionally have been leaders on the telecommunications and 5G space like Nokia and Ericsson are able to capitalize on the opportunity. But again, because they don't have a huge market share and they haven't created the kind of supplies that would be necessary to fill the gap, they're now rushing to create that supply. For a smaller company, you don't have necessarily the cash available to invest and build up a big supply and maintain that supply of goods if you don't know that you'll be able to sell. And so it's understanding these forces at play and how they affect your own ability to create strategic plans for your business that are very important. Similarly, the danger of splinternets, or what's been referred to as the balkanization of the internet. That's a huge issue right now for a lot of different firms that supply digital content, because of countries like Iran, which has basically tried to create its own internal country internet to be able to control what people in the country can access and read and do and buy. You're going to have a lot of challenges where smaller companies will not be able to compete. They'll not be able to have access to overseas markets. That'll hamper growth. Similarly, in countries that pursue splinternets or kind of data localization and other issues, we're seeing difficulties by foreign firms to get in, and then we're also seeing a brain drain coming out, because if people aren't able to rely on an open internet, if they're not able to rely on the ability to access information freely and quickly, they're not able to really do the kind of innovation that a lot of countries are going to need to be able to be competitive players on the digital market. And of course, that does present opportunities for domestic firms that are going to be able to fill the gap, but a lot of times, again, they're not really able to capitalize on the opportunity because they face a lot of restrictions on access, and they have to play by certain rules that hamper innovation. Finally, just some of the major issues that we refer to as geo-cyber. At that intersection of geopolitics and cybersecurity, we've seen a huge increase in state-sponsored and industrial espionage and IP theft and forced tech transfer, and a lot of companies that sort of think they're immune from these types of issues and they're not likely to be targeted in a state-sponsored attack on their data or on their platforms. They're really finding out that because of who they might work with or who they might supply, they can be used as an attack vector, or they can be used as an access point to reach other companies. And if you're not understanding what you're connected to, who you're connected to, and how you can be used, you're really not doing the work you need to do to mitigate your exposure to these issues. Similarly, high-tech supply chains are dependent on certain types of vendors, certain types of technology, and they can't be stood up overnight if one is destroyed in a natural disaster or an act of violence. And so companies really need to have a better understanding of what can we do if that warehouse that we're dependent on or that production facility that we're dependent on goes down. You really need to have a business continuity plan in place. And unfortunately, even companies that do have a business continuity plan, they fail to practice them regularly enough to be able to put them into action when a tragedy happens or a crisis strikes. And so they're creating, again, more vulnerabilities for themselves where they have a huge lag time, lost revenue because their platform is down or because they can't resupply. And that leads to a lot of issues. And really understanding how political issues can play into that is really important, because if you have an embargo or you have a new data localization law and you have no way to deal with it, you're going to be down for quite a while. And so it's not, again, just the physical and the digital technology and physical facilities that underpin your supply chains, really understanding these broader issues. Finally, we're seeing, sort of a realization that insurance is no longer enough, that proactive measures are really necessary to deal with a lot of these issues. One thing that we at VerSprite do is we advocate for companies to not only practice their business continuity plan, but to actually invest in interactive simulations that allow a company to really bring a lot of people into the room and deal with a scenario and practice how they would deal with it and make tweaks to their process to really make sure that they're ready to meet any kind of crisis situation and to get ahead of issues. So really helping companies understand what information should they be taking in, what data do they need to rely on to monitor, to be coming into their systems, and how can they really address that before it becomes a really pressing matter. I will turn it over back to Keon to do the panel discussion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Malcolm and Andrew on some of these issues and some of the audience questions.
Cool. Thanks, Milena. I think it was great that you were able to provide such a detailed overview of the topic. You know, if you asked every layperson that was floating around, how do they define geopolitical risks, how do they define supply chain risks, we probably would have ended up with a variety of answers. I think the foundation that was provided puts us all on the same page, looking at things from the same perspective. And with that, I'll turn the first question over to Malcolm to start us off. Malcolm, considering all the things that you've seen, especially being at Intel, with Intel being a manufacturer and having to deal with supply chains globally for different components, and even considering what you've done in your most recent role, where do you see the most dramatic changes in supply chain from an infrastructure perspective?
Yeah, great question. You know, and I think you know, what was mentioned earlier really kind of plays itself out. And I think the biggest change that we've seen is the fact that the physical and logical supply chains are blending. And I think historically, most organizations, particularly manufacturers, thought about geopolitical risk in the legal and regulatory side of it. They thought about nation states at war with each other and disruption of shipments, right? So the physical supply chain aspects of geopolitical risk. And now in the digital sense, we have to think about things differently. We have to think about, you know, some of the disruption events that were talked about, and the espionage and that type of stuff. But where I think many organizations are lacking is that blend of physical and logical, right? How do I compromise a digital supply chain in order to create a physical issue? A physical compromise to create a digital issue. You know, late last year, Bloomberg did a big expose on what they believe was super micro, and the physical compromise of a digital asset that then flowed into the infrastructure of organizations in order to do nation-state espionage. We've seen the Huawei stuff in the news recently, right? And can it be trusted? And the U.S. is pushing on that. So I think when you start thinking about the digital supply chain, you have to start thinking about where is the code for the software written? How is it validated? And is there an opportunity in that quote unquote digital supply chain for manipulation, physically or logically, that could then affect your company, your organization, or society? And we shouldn't get worried so much about where the technology is created, but how it's validated to do what it's intended to do, and making sure that we are minimizing the vulnerabilities in that to minimize its potential impact.
Hey, that was a great response. Related to the validation, I would love to turn it over to Andrew, knowing what his company does in terms of forensic investigation and, you know, their influence on some global activities that are happening. Andrew, do you have anything to add to where you're seeing, either personally or as a company, some of the most dramatic changes in supply chain infrastructure?
Well, I would second what Malcolm said about the kind of convergence of the cyber and physical infrastructure space. And, you know, you're seeing a lot of physical trade that's enabled by digital technologies, whether it's the kind of order processing systems that we're seeing with e-commerce, or even the facilitation of international trade through borders. You know, the custom, the approvals to ship things internationally, and, you know, all that, those kinds of documents that are necessary are now done very largely electronically. So even the kind of government level administration of physical supply chains is electronic. And if you were to have a disruption in your, you know, the electronic side of the supply chain, the physical side is going to come to a halt. because you won't have the permissions to move things across borders, or you won't have a truck where it needs to be in order to pick up your shipment. We're also seeing, and this has been going on for quite some time, a recognition that, data is part of international trade. And so you have regulations like ITAR that control, the flow of data about products that may be considered sensitive by a country. So, this idea that there's a separate cyber supply chain has not been the case for quite some time. That convergence that Malcolm mentioned is really the rule rather than the exception.
Well, so thinking about the convergence as a topic, and I'll turn it back over to Malcolm real quick. If you think about convergence and there is no separate supply chain and everything is integrated, without doing a paid infomercial, is there anybody that you can think of who's leading the pack in terms of using supply chain data effectively, taking security seriously, and really doing the integration properly? And, when you think about those companies or organizations or people who have good processes, are there lessons that other people can learn by adopting the approaches that they're using?
Well, I think, without mentioning organizations per se, I think one way you can ascertain whether or not a company or organization understands the convergence is to look at their structure, because I'm a big believer in structure drives behavior and you get what you measure. And if they have structured information security, physical security, and product and service security separate from each other, and they don't have an overarching governance to bring them together, they're managing those risks in silos, which means they're not actually fully understanding those risks and managing them. Organizations that have a structure that brings together physical, logical, product and service, at least at a structural level, is demonstrating they understand the interdependencies of those risks and how they need to be managed from that convergence perspective. And I think if you step back and you just look at the Fortune 1000, there's very few organizations that have those things all together. And they don't necessarily have to be under one person, but they don't have a governance structure that binds them to understand the risk interdependencies and the control interdependencies that need to occur.
Cool. And Andrew, do you have anything to add to that, just in terms of practices, procedures, processes that are demonstrating excellence in doing this well?
This day and age where what a business is doing today is not what a business was doing 3 months ago or 6 months ago or a year ago. Their business has changed, the business, their client engagement has changed, their risk profile has changed. Without governance, what ends up happening is you get those silos that Malcolm mentioned, where physical security is doing their own thing and cybersecurity is doing their own thing, and then the production and operations side may be doing something completely separate. And that's where problems crop in. As Malcolm said, the people that govern these operations as part of a strategic process that looks at where the company is going, forces like digital transformation and increasing international regulation, and kind of build that into their strategy as the business evolves, are the ones that do this very successfully. The ones that don't, or let that kind of governance thing get out of control or out of mind, find themselves in awkward situations.
Cool. And then, so shifting gears a little bit, and I'll throw this to Milena first. When you're thinking about how geopolitical risks are affecting the supply chains, can you recommend any kind of innovative workarounds that you guys have seen companies make to bypass or mitigate the challenges from a geopolitical perspective?
Sure. So one issue that continues to come up is, of course, the fact that China, for example, has laws in place that require any entity operating in mainland China to support China's intelligence services in their strategic priorities. And that is, a major challenge for a lot of foreign companies that want to tap into the Chinese market, but are worried about IP issues or worried about their data being used by the Chinese government in order to calculate things like loyalty scores, et cetera. And so there's been, an increased focus on creating separate spun out entities that are able to block off and segregate certain types of information and keep it here or in a country where you don't face the same types of dangers. But the risks are really tremendous in terms of issues like insider threats, which haven't really been fully appreciated until we've seen a couple of major cases recently. Probably everybody has heard about the T-Mobile situation where T-Mobile employees are being incentivized to share information with Chinese firms and force tech transfer and, continuous IP theft through insider threat means really presents a challenge that a lot of companies haven't really confronted in the past. And so making sure that no one person has access to a lot of information, making sure that, you have methodologies in place where you can continuously audit and monitor access and make sure that people only have the access they really need to do their job, making sure to turn off access when someone's been terminated or resigned. Really going through these things very methodically and thinking through what information you hold, what are your organization's crown jewels, for example, or very, very sensitive information, really taking the time to understand who can access them, where they're stored, what devices are linked to them. Those are the issues that really need to go into how companies approach this, and they can't really take a mentality where we're just going to ignore it, or we think we're too small, it won't affect us, because we're increasingly seeing that, again, these smaller firms or individuals who think they're immune are unwitting or witting attack vectors through which cyber criminals and state-sponsored hackers can actually get into very sensitive information. So we really recommend that people take the time to assess and audit their processes and make, truly a very detailed and complete assessment of their profile, and take the time to ensure that people are trained in the workflows that a company demands. What we've seen a lot of times is a company's workflows are very tedious or cumbersome, or they don't work properly, and people reach for their personal phone to snap a picture of sensitive information to send along or something like that. And they don't really understand that if your phone is compromised and you just took a picture of very sensitive information, you could be opening up your company to exacerbated vulnerabilities and a lot of really expensive problems down the line. So really taking the time to train workforces and understanding how everything they do on a daily basis can, again, either mitigate or exacerbate their exposure is really important.
That's some great insight. Malcolm, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think it was captured well, and I think, again, it just becomes a how do you prioritize things, again, because these are complex issues, and you're going to need that diversity of perspective from the organization. You're going to need to think in what I call in terms of extinction events. What are the events that could cause an extinction event for your company? Be so disruptive that you could go out of business or your customers could be affected. And I think when you start prioritizing to those substantial critical risks, you can start to tease out those interdependencies and make the right priorities. Because the hard time people sometimes have is really stepping back and going, there's all these things. What do I look at first, right? And how do I get focus? And that's where I think, again, if you think about what could create the most disruption for your organization and the most impact on your customers, and focus on those things first. I know it sounds simple, but it begins and ends with risk. And if we really just think about those things that could have the most material impact, it brings things into focus and creates a sharpness with which we can take action.
Cool. So the next question will go to Andrew, and I'll shift gears a little bit, just because I know how much time Andrew's company spends in legal issues. So the next question kind of focuses on the extent to which countries are dealing with threats to intellectual property and how that affects legal protections, the controls that they have in place, and how all of that influences the supply chain. Andrew, do you have anything that you can share with the audience that would help us navigate these waters properly?
So I don't know that I have any specific navigational aids as much as kind of observations on what we're seeing in the regulatory environment globally. And, IP protection is certainly, a big part of what organizations are concerned about, though IP protection tends to be handled at a treaty level between countries. And while many countries do have rules that regulate IP, a lot of things like IP theft would fall under their, for example, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or something that's more of a kind of data protection act. But what we're seeing organizations really struggle with is this kind of complex Venn diagram of all the regulations that they're subject to. Whether it's some kind of IP related regulation or a data privacy regulation, a mishmash of data breach notification regulations, and each of these regulations defines things differently. If you've ever read GDPR or you've read any government regulation, the first couple of pages are definitions of, when I say personal data, what do I mean? If I say intellectual property, what do I mean? And unfortunately, none of those are harmonized. They all mean something a little differently. So if you're looking at an organization that's trying to make sure that their digital supply chain, physical supply chain are secure and in regulatory compliance, doing those regulatory overlays to kind of understand what your obligations are can get very, very complicated. And then, being as we're in an environment where supply chains tend to involve third-party partners, figuring out what their obligations are to you and to the environments in which they operate adds a further complication. That's part of that whole risk management when you're dealing with third parties, or if you are the third party, how do you make yourself a low risk partner to your prospective clients? So I think what we're seeing right now is that there's just a lot of regulations that are being put out by various governments with different objectives in mind. And they tend to conflict with each other, and kind of figuring out how to harmonize all of that is a challenge.
So I'll turn it over to Malcolm real quick. Thinking about the complexity of regulatory compliance, Andrew mentioned some great concerns that kind of point our boat in the right direction, so to speak, in terms of navigation. Do you have any best practices that you would recommend in addition to the regulatory overlays that Andrew highlighted that would help people address some of these supply chain risks that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, one of them gets back to having good local contacts, right, and having your organization have from that regulatory complexity, the right legal counsel, either as external counsel or local attorneys that can help you navigate that challenges. But I think we've also got to think about nation states, right? They're competitors. They compete with each other physically, logically. They have different political motivations, And so we should never expect nation states to fully harmonize things because they have their own incentives and their own motivations. And so I think that complexity is always going to be there. And I think it's, given the volatility and the nationalism that we've seen rise up over the past decade in almost every country, that's exacerbating the complexity. And so I think it just becomes a question of where you do business, how you do business, and how to the best extent possible, you limit the risk to your organization and your customers, as well as, capitalize on the opportunities that might exist in each country. And so it just really becomes an optimization issue to navigate that complexity.
I think that's fair. Milena, you're a bit of an expert in this area, especially when we kind of branch out into the geopolitical arena. Do you have any closing thoughts on the IP conversation and how organizations can navigate these waters?
I do. So let's take a look at, not to harp on China, but to go back to that part of the world. When you think about China's complexity and the issues involved with Taiwan and China having a one-China vision and Taiwan trying to assert independence, we've seen, for example, Taiwan rise up and become a major supplier of very high-tech components and gadgets and all of that. And China has a Made in China 2025 policy where it wants everything to be increasingly made domestically, to be a leader in tech innovation and tech development and tech production. And so that kind of national, priority that other panelists mentioned is in full view there, and people are still not kind of appreciating the complexity. So you have, for example, a U.S. firm that outsources production to a supplier in Taiwan, and that supplier is excellent at what they do, but they run into some financial difficulties, and they get bought up by another company that turns out to be a major competitor of the American company, and even further, they're based in China. And now they have access to IP that is sharing with the Taiwanese production facility, because you can't produce something without having the specifications to produce it. And now that competitor has direct access to that IP and is helping China kind of find its way to that IP so that it can fulfill its goals Made in China 2025. And what can you even do? If you're the U.S. company, you have to contend with the fact that Taiwan's IP protections are governed by a Trade Secrets Act that was passed in 1996 that hasn't really fully integrated all of the different enormous changes that have occurred in the past 25 years. And not only that, the Act has certain protections in place where, for example, in one country, you would have a confidentiality provision governing the investigation phase and the later court case adjudicating the matter. In Taiwan, the confidentiality provision only kicks in once there's been a motion in court and doesn't protect the investigation phase. So now, if you're the American firm, you can't even pursue legal action because not only has your IP been compromised through the purchase of the supplier by a direct Chinese competitor, but if you lodge a complaint, the investigation process can lead to even more disclosures that could happen along the line. And so really understanding the very, very detailed intricacies of all these different situations, we've sort of taken an approach where, we can just sue them in a U.S. court, but actually implementing the sentence, actually getting anything done as a result, and really protecting very expensive to lose IP, expensive to develop IP, isn't really fully appreciated by everyone. And again, that is why we really urge people to all come to the table together and not to silo these functions, and to have people appreciate all of the ways that geocyber issues are entangled in even their daily workflows, and to really understand where you could be vulnerable through something like a direct competitor acquiring a supplier. And if you have no alternative, if you haven't thought through where else could you produce your item, you could face potentially a situation where your highest selling, your piece de resistance item is now going to be lost to a direct competitor. And if you haven't thought it through, you're really caught flat-footed. And so really doing proactive work is really important now more than ever. And we're still seeing people who are taking too much of a reactive approach to it and believing that they'll be covered through insurance and other protections that really don't do as much as they really think they will.
So that was a really, really great summary of a lot of the challenges that people are facing, and it kind of leads somewhat into some of the opportunities that exist. I'll hand it over to Andrew to lead us off in this part of the discussion. But thinking about all the challenges, all of the problems, all of the risks that we've talked about in this point to the conversation, Andrew, can you share with us anything that you would highlight as an opportunity that exists related to the global supply chain and risk management and some of the geopolitical concerns that we've talked about to this point, so that we can end the conversation on a higher, more encouraging note?
Sure. So, organization to navigate these situations and are kind of looking ahead as far as is possible, are kind of a return or maybe double down on things in the governance category, understanding the data that they hold and where they hold it, understanding their business processes, both in terms of enumerating them and identifying those impacts should that process be compromised in some way. That crown jewel identification that was mentioned earlier, and being able to align all of those with what's really important to the organization, both from a negative and a positive standpoint. What does the organization need to do to be successful? And as Malcolm mentioned, what are those extinction events that the organization needs to avoid? So by maintaining the reins on those high-level, those kind of high-level perspectives and understanding what their own organization is doing, when something unusual happens that disrupts their supply chain, for example, the rapid implementation of tariffs, which we have seen recently, or a change in the regulatory environment that may have unexpected consequences downstream. And in that case, I'm thinking of the effect that GDPR has had on the call center industry in India due to restrictions on being able to access and move data offshore to India, to call centers in India. The organizations that have that understanding of where their business interests, data lies, and what their processes are able to adapt much more quickly and even to see advantage in those changing environments. If they can react more rapidly than their competitors and react positively, then that's a huge advantage for them. So that's kind of what we're seeing as, as we get engaged in like M&A activity and regulatory responses, is the success in those environments are directly related to their success at the governance level.
Cool. And Malcolm, did you have anything that you can share with the audience in terms of opportunities and positive solutions that we can use to tackle these challenges?
Yeah, well, again, getting back to my perspective on risk, every business, when you go into business, is taking a risk. And those that are best at managing the risks capture the most opportunities. And so I think we shouldn't be afraid of these things. We need to, and I've said this before, even in the security space, to chief security officers, chief information security officers, you need to run at the risky things in order to shape the path of the risk. You can't stick your head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist. And those that run to the risky things, seek to understand the risks, seek to maximize the opportunities of it, and do that well, will be in the best position.
That was a great answer. It sounded like a closing thought more than a summary of the topic. Before we go into the closing thoughts, just for me personally, one thing that stands out when people are talking about supply chain management is the use of blockchain. Blockchain is not exclusive to cryptocurrencies. I've seen all kinds of patents, all kinds of stories, all kinds of news items that talk about different uses of blockchain. Real quick before we go into our closing conversations, and we'll start with Milena, and it'll be the same question for everybody. Do you think that blockchain is a solution to the supply chain challenges that we're facing in modern times?
I think that blockchain is sort of not quite at its mature stage yet. We're seeing a lot of different pilots that are used by companies to try to manage supply chain issues on a blockchain and finding that it isn't quite well adaptable yet. Some of the problems are that supply chains are extremely long. They involve a lot of people. They involve a lot of people in rural areas with low connectivity, and blockchain runs into issues where you have to really have everybody using the same platform. You have to have people who have good connectivity, who don't, again, reach for a workaround when the transaction or processing time is very long. And so it is very difficult to get all of these things to work together well. A friend of mine who is very tapped into sort of very long supply chains throughout Africa tells me that one of the problems they're facing is that they can't even get everybody to start using a device to record things onto anything, let alone having them adapt to a blockchain. So there's people that are still using paper ledgers, kind of like bills of lading in times of old, and these are easy to compromise. They can be lost, they can be, changed, they can be used to hide criminal activity, whatever it is. And so it'll take a very long time for a blockchain to be adapted, if it ever is. And right now, the costs of trying to use it far outweigh the benefits. I think for every dollar invested, the return is only about 70 cents at this point for a lot of the blockchain pilots that have taken place. But I also, you don't necessarily need a tremendous blockchain to tell you where your device came from or to track every single thing on a very multi-gigabyte ledger, the same way that maybe Tom wants to know where his tomato came from at Whole Foods. That would be comparatively easy to do, whereas a device with 100 components, that would be much more complicated to do. So I think it holds some promise for certain applications, but I don't think it'll be sort of the one-size-fits-all type of solution that some of its earlier evangelists claimed it would be.
Cool. And Malcolm, having worked at a manufacturing organization, and because you're a business person and you understand all the ins and outs of the organizations that you supported, do you see any viability or opportunity to use blockchain technology as a solution for some of these supply chain issues?
I do think it has applicability. I do agree there's a maturation that needs to occur. But even a few years ago, Walmart, and I think they partnered up with IBM or somebody, there was some articles on this, that they were starting to evaluate for, again, food safety data. Again, you could argue it's not that hard to track where the tomato came from, other than the fact that it actually is, and the fact that it in some cases for a recall, it can take days, if not weeks, to figure out where what farm the tomato came from and then what stores it went to. And what they were trying to do was speed up the ability to recall and know the source of stuff, and they were starting to use blockchain for that. I think there's some promise in some of those areas, so it might not fully solve the issue, but it might, if you could digitize and use blockchains for that, actually speed up the identification and remediation of supply chain issues. And I think if, again, we look at the business outcome we're trying to get out of these things, blockchain could show promise in that speed of identification and speed of control.
Awesome. And Andrew, the final word on the viability of blockchain in supporting some of our supply chain and geopolitical concerns?
Well, I think the consensus is that it holds promise, but is not quite ready for prime time. It has the ability to allow us to validate certain transactions, but as Milena pointed out, if you're trying to track the source of all the components in an automobile using blockchain, that's a pretty complex operation. That's a little different than if you're trying to track the provenance of a piece of fine art. So, figuring out if it's the appropriate tool for the appropriate application is part of that maturation process. And then how it gets applied, in the legal community, what kind of blockchain due diligence do you need to do during an M&A acquisition or divestiture? What kind of blockchain investigations are going to be performed as part of court litigations, and what are the standards in those areas? Those are all going to be determined during this kind of maturation time that I think we're in the middle of right now.
Cool. So I think we've covered quite a bit of content in a short amount of time. One of the challenges with a 1-hour panel discussion via webinar is that it's impossible to dig into depth everything that there is to discuss for all of the items. So what we'll do with these final few minutes is allow each one of our speakers to give a parting shot. The slide that I have up lists the Twitter handle for each of our speakers, and this will enable everybody who joined the participation, either live or on the recording, to reach out to our speakers, to engage with them, to expand the discussion, and we hope that you enjoyed this. I'll turn it over to Milena first to kind of close us out with your final 1-minute summary of what is most important or what should people take away, and then we'll have Malcolm and then Andrew close us out before we end.
Sure. I would say the biggest issue right now is for companies to really take stock of their own vulnerabilities and their own exposure, and to really do it clear-eyed and confronting all the difficult challenges they might face. Reactive measures are not enough anymore, and proactivity will have to be the name of the game going forward if companies want to stay ahead of these issues. It's the same that I tell friends who are sort of in the machine learning space. They're always saying, oh, well, we teach them enough, they'll be able to help us predict. But they're really learning on things that have happened in the past, and people who are trying to do very bad things to supply chains and to our companies and to our data are always thinking ahead, and they're always trying to be creative. And to defend against that, companies really have to take the same approach, to really be continuing to innovate, and really continuing to take stock of the picture that they're facing and the way that it's changing, and not relying on old strategies to tackle new challenges.
Cool. Thank you very much. And to you, Malcolm?
Yeah, and it goes off of what I had said earlier that you had said was a little bit more of a closing comment. A lot of organizations will stick their head in the sand on this stuff, because it is complex. We live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. And we've got to be possibility thinkers. We've got to think about the possibilities of risk. We've got to think about the possibilities with the opportunities those risks could present if we manage them well. And I think if organizations do that and really start contemplating risks and figuring out creative ways to manage them, they'll be better suited to navigate the challenging waters we have currently.
Cool. And Andrew?
Yeah, so over the course of the last 10 years or so, having done a whole bunch of different kinds of engagements for M&A or investigations of various types of compromise, be it supply chain or something else, regulatory inquiries, just all kinds of things that kind of spin around this environment that we've been talking about. We consistently see the organizations with the better outcomes or the organizations that have done the advanced thinking. They're the ones with the detailed data and process maps. They're the ones that can model how their business and the risk environment actually works for them and how it helps them to be successful. So when an unexpected event happens, be it a supply chain compromise, an insider threat, whatever, a new tariff, whatever it happens to be, they're able to pivot quickly and take appropriate action. So even if it ends up in litigation or something like that, their costs are lower and their outcomes are better. So I guess the final thought for me is, the more you can understand about your own organization, the risks, the vulnerabilities, the opportunities, the way your business functions, the better your overall outcomes are going to be as things change.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of CLASS-LLC and for our partner VerSprite, I'd like to thank everybody for joining the webinar. Thank you for the contribution from all of our speakers. This would have been a very different presentation if we didn't have your insight, so I really appreciate your participation. For the audience, if you would like the slides that we use to present the topic, they're available under the attachments and links tab in the presentation. You are also able to go back and look at the recording if you missed anything. I encourage you to reach out to the speakers and connect with them directly, and thank you again for your participation.